A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. What happens that we have these demands that we make on life? So let us remind ourselves that not taking things personal, or taking things personal is a better way to say it, has to do with that we make everything about us. Is that we, in one way, we make ourselves too important. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You see, if as Herb was saying, I love that line that Roger even quoted last time about we think of ourselves as the center of the universe instead of just the center of our world, right? Is that there's a big difference in that. But if I think about myself as the center of the universe, it means that everything you do in our relationship is related to me. That's that sense of personal importance. Now, I don't think it's circumstantial that Bill talks about that self-centeredness, self-will run riot, selfishness is the root of our problem. But the root of our problem is the personal importance we feel. That's what makes us so self-centered. The self-centeredness grows out of that I make everything about me. That's that sense of personal importance. So, where does that come from? What happens with that? Well, I've said before, one way that to look at this is if we pathologize it, it says that there's something wrong with us that we're doing that we're making everything about us. But instead of looking at this pathologically, I want us to consider that this is more of a developmental issue and to give ourselves a little bit of a break. Because what happens is that everybody starts this world incredibly dependent on environmental support, right? And when we're born, right, we start to take these steps towards supporting ourselves. But still, when we're born, it's all about us. Our consciousness cannot imagine others. That is something that starts to happen later on because early on, our consciousness is everything is about us. The mother's there to meet our needs, or whoever our child care giver is that person's there to meet our needs, and we think they're on call 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, and any mother knows that feeling. That child doesn't have an awareness of the other. Eventually, the awareness of the other unfolds, but it unfolds very gradually. Now, what determines that shift from that fusion early on in life to being more and more differentiated into a self that is separate from others has to do with the level of differentiation that existed in our family. So what do I mean by differentiation? Well, differentiation is a concept that Dr. Murray Bowen talked about, and it's related to developmental cell biology. Every cell begins its life undifferentiated, which means that the DNA, the programming inside that cell, has not expressed itself yet by turning on certain genes and turning off certain genes according to this complex formula that's operating. And so as the as the DNA expresses itself, that cell becomes more and more differentiated, which means it becomes more and more what it's supposed to be. If a cell is moved early on in its development, when it's still undifferentiated, let's say it's going to be an eye, but it's moved to the cheek of a fetus, it does something that's very interesting. It picks up the DNA programming from all the cells surrounding it in its microenvironment, and it now reprograms its own DNA to fit in. How many of us relate to that? We reprogram our own DNA to fit in. My God, we all do that. In adolescence, that peer pressure to be a part of the group is so strong, and it's so easy to lose ourselves in that. Now, that is mediated by how well a family is differentiated. So if that cell differentiates itself and now it is what it's going to be and it's moved to the cheek, it won't change its basic nature. A third eye will grow on the fetus's cheek if that cell is differentiated because it doesn't get overly influenced by what's going on around it, by its microenvironment. Every family has a certain level of differentiation that we grow up in. And we can only grow to the highest level of differentiation that our parents have achieved. They've done the same coming from their family. So they can only bring to us what they've achieved in their previous family. And that's why we say this is a multi-generational process that's taking place. I love the metaphor that Virginia Satir used to use about this stuff. She says, just imagine that our umbilical cords are never cut and think of the connections in your life and where they lead. And that's what's influencing our level of differentiation. It's passed on from generation to generation. The more undifferentiated a family is, the more pressure there's going to be to think like everybody else. The more things are going to be taken personally when a family is undifferentiated. The more reactivity is going to take place when a family is undifferentiated. The more rules and expectations they're going to have about how things are supposed to be when a family is undifferentiated. So that's the emotional climate that we're growing up in. Now, if a family is differentiated as a child moves through this stage of personal importance, it's all about me, they start to get a sense of themselves as separate from others. But in a family that's differentiated, separateness becomes a threat to togetherness rather than as another dimension of it. I will say that again. In an undifferentiated family, separateness becomes a threat to togetherness, not another dimension of that connectedness or relatedness. The more differentiated a family is, the healthier it is. The more differentiated a family is, the more respect there's going to be for differences amongst members. If a family is undifferentiated, there will be very little respect for differences. There will be a lot of pressure to conform. So you can imagine if that's the climate that we're growing up in, our behavior, our sense of self is going to be largely influenced by that. And we don't even realize it because what's normal for us is normal for us. What's existing in our family is what we think reality is. But it is just the reality that our family has. And that's why we say when two people come together and form a relationship, every relationship is a mixed relationship. It's not just race. It's not just a white person with a Hispanic or black person or whatever. It's going to be mixed because you're mixing family cultures, and there's always going to be differences in those family cultures. And it's an amazing surprise when you're undifferentiated that, my God, people think differently and do things differently than I do and think about things differently. They experience love in a different way than I do. This is why that book, The Languages of Love, became so popular, because it was asking us to have a more differentiated consciousness around this stuff. As we differentiate ourselves, we take things less personally. The more reactive you are and the more you take things personally, suggest your level of differentiation. As you move to higher levels of differentiation, you're not going to be taking things personally and you're not going to be as reactive. At higher levels of differentiation, when a person's behaving a certain way, you're going to see that as what they're doing, not what they're doing to you. There will not be what we call this reflected sense of self. When we're undifferentiated, everything everybody's doing is reflecting how they feel about us. But when we're differentiated, we realize that what they're doing is reflecting who they are, not how they feel about us, but how they deal with the world. Even if what they're upset about is something with us, how they deal with it has to do with who they are, not who we are. So a very, very good measure of where you're at in your differentiation is going to be how reactive you are. So you can do a very interesting thing. For the next week, and Herb will probably take over the lead next week, and I wasn't prepared to do this. I have something else I want to do the week after that, so we'll be doing this for a few more weeks. I want you to try to carry with you a little small notebook, one of those little spiral things. And every time you take something personally during the course of a day and write down Monday, I want you to put a little hashtag on it. And at the end of the day, see how many times you've taken things personally, even if it's a slight thing that you took personally. Like, why did that person cut me off? Like, my God, everybody driving should be aware of who I am and that I'm on the road and they should be careful of my existence. Even if it's something like that, if you get upset, put a hashtag down. Keep track of that over the course of a week. See if you can get, is there a certain number that happens every day? Are you like averaging about 8 taking things personally per day? Track that right now, because 6 months from now, we can come back to this. And I'll even ask Tom if you could even make a note in this, is to do it again and see if there's a change after you're working on this emotional sobriety. Because what emotional sobriety does, it helps you grow yourself. It helps you differentiate yourself. It creates a consciousness where you start to really question, how come I'm reacting the way I'm reacting? Not what's wrong with everybody else, but what is off with me? And notice I said off, not wrong with me. I don't want us to shame ourselves with this work. I want us to support ourselves so we can grow along these lines. And none of us is going to do this perfectly. We know that. We're going to make progress, and that's what we want to start to track is our progress. So, taking things personally is determined by your level of differentiation. It's determined by your level of emotional maturity. Your level of differentiation when you step out into the world was determined by your family. You leave your family with the highest. Many people say when we enter a relationship, we choose someone that's going to be plus or minus about 5 points from where we're at in our level of differentiation. Now, of course, we always think we're the more differentiated person in our relationship. But I'm here to tell you, they're in the same range that you are. They're not a lot worse than you, and they're not a lot better than you in terms of differentiation. They're not a lot more developed and a lot less developed is a better way to say it. So let's start to familiarize ourselves and start to think of ourselves in terms of how well am I differentiated? Now, differentiation, the higher your differentiation, the more emotional autonomy you will feel. Your behavior will not be as interdependent. The more under differentiated you are, the more interdependent your behavior is in your relationship. The higher the stakes are at all of your interactions. The lower your differentiation, the more anxiety and depression you're going to feel. The less resilience you will have in terms of being able to deal with being knocked off balance. When your differentiation is low, you will use what we call stonewalling or the emotional cutoff to deal with a lot of situations that make you uncomfortable, just cutting people out of your life because they're toxic. The more differentiated you are, you won't have to do that because you're not drinking their poison. When you're undifferentiated, you drink everybody's poison. You take their black magic and make it yours. So I'm hoping that that's going to give you a bit of a schema, a bit of a structure to start thinking about how you're functioning in your life and where your level of differentiation is at. And so with that being said, I'll invite Roger and Tom in the room and pat myself on the back for doing a pretty good job for improvising for 20 minutes.
No, no surprise there. I think you kind of wrote the book on some of this stuff, literally.
I think I did write the book on some of this.
Yeah. I I do have to just point out that we've talked about taking things personally, right? You and I just the other night, where um, I, since we started this Zoom, Thursday night meeting, in the beginning, I was like, well, why isn't he calling on me? Aren't I getting involved? And then and I know where that voice comes from, right? It's the, lack of differentiation and some gaps in my development that I experienced as a child, and how I try to fill that in with current relationships. And I have an answer for the why not, and they're all valid why nots. It doesn't, but emotional sobriety for me is not the elimination of these things arising, right? They are lessened, but when they do arise, it's like, oh, there's that thing again, right? That arises because I'm taking this thing personally, and it gives me an opportunity to look at it. And right, it's not wrong, like as you mentioned, right? It's not something that's wrong with me. It's something that I can look at and kind of plug in and see what's being triggered for me. So like I appreciate in a way that this workshop in itself, this Thursday night, has not just let's say created some toes to get stepped on, as Bill Wilson puts it, but it's almost like it's but like the fact that it's called a workshop because these things come up as a result of just being here and hearing these stories and participating, and and it gets to be worked out in real time.
Right. Right on, Tom. That's so true. I appreciate you sharing a personal example of that.
And I've got to, and don't take it personally. I just got to go take care of my dog real quick. Roger, you got the floor.
I've got the floor, but what am I going to do with the floor, Tom? Oh, I'm sorry. It's a metaphor. Um, so Nathaniel Branden, in his writings on self-esteem, points out that as we find ways to grow our self-esteem, much of the same ways of thinking and feeling come to characterize us as when we become more differentiated, as when we grow our emotional sobriety. An example of that is when things that happen that are unexpected, to the extent our self-esteem is higher, to the extent we are more differentiated. And another way to say that is my sense of self and a sense of centeredness or groundedness or solidness in myself is stronger. So for you, Alan, tonight, you were confronted with an unexpected situation, and you were able to present your comments in a really good way. Now, there are other factors that come to that. How many times you presented material on the same topic is a factor that comes into that. The fact you did write a book on this subject that you gave a lot of thought in the course of writing it. But still, I notice when I'm in a place where I'm experiencing a clearer and stronger sense of autonomy, as you said it a few minutes ago, uh, where I am in a positive way more centered in myself. Unexpected events don't fluster me nearly as much. They don't throw me uh, out of whack, out of kilter nearly as much. Um, Something else you said really triggered a thought for me. I mentioned last week that, to rephrase it briefly, when we really begin to grasp the idea that, it's a mistake to take the behavior of other people toward us and the words they say to us personally, um, that's kind of liberating. It's kind of freeing in terms of, oh my God, so everything people says to me, everything that people say to me and do toward me that's negative or critical, it's about them. It's not about me. So that's kind of freeing, quite liberating. But as I said last week, as you point out in this chapter, it also applies to the positive things they say about us, that those also, in all likelihood, have more to do with them than to do with me. And then the other idea I mentioned, which is what I'm going to comment on what you shared. What happens when we realize that much, if not most, of our reactions to other people is about us? And we all want to believe that my reactions to others, especially if it's strongly positive or strongly negative, is about them. And to some extent, it can be. I mean, our emotional reactions are based on our perceptions, right? They're based on how we see other people as safe or as threatening, and so on. And some of those perceptions are going to be accurate, and some of them are not going to be accurate. So it's not like nothing we think about other people has to do with them, or nothing they think toward us has to do with us. Of course, some of those things are going to have to do with us. But here's the issue. While some of the information that is involved in how they see me about myself, I'm self-centered, or I'm caring, or I'm fearful, or whatever it is, while the information may be accurate, how I react to that information is what Alan said a few minutes ago. That's what's going to have a lot more to do with me than with you. If I'm the one having the reaction, my perceptions of you, or your perceptions of me, might have a lot of accuracy to them.
Yeah.
But how I communicate that, and how charged and energized it is, and how positive it is, or how negative it is, that's going to have much more to do with me if I'm the one doing that than it
But
has
you
to
know
do with
what you're
you.
saying, though, Roger, is very important because, see, this is not a strategy to dismiss feedback
Right.
about our behavior. And please understand that there's a lot of growth that takes place by listening to somebody who is upset with you, listening to somebody or a friend that's pointing out something and stuff. And what we're saying is that the way they're doing that is on them. But there could be some valuable information in what they're saying, or what motivating them to talk to us about this particular issue, that they can have, like Roger is saying, an experience with us that's worthy of us taking a look at, right? That if my behavior is, let's say, if I'm apologizing all the time and somebody gets really frustrated with that and angry about it, that their anger and frustration with me is their way of dealing with it. But if my apologizing is what I need to look at, and how come I feel like I have to apologize for even breathing the oxygen I breathe in this world? See, so this is not a strategy to dismiss feedback. We grow through feedback. This is very important, man. We go through this grinding process that takes place between people. But if I take it personally, then it adds a layer to it that makes it very hard to learn from the grinding.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do. This is a very nuanced what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
Yeah.
Alan, in one of the previous workshops, this is a while ago, you had said to somebody, it was during the discussion part, you had said something like, be careful about labeling people as toxic relationships, and that I've cut them out because they're toxic. And that blew me away because that is something that, from other, relationship recovery programs, that, and even in 12-step stuff, people, places, and things, concept that we almost need to insulate ourselves from the people who, stir things up for us, and not dismissing safety and security, but those tough relationships, if I hold still and get the feedback, and or go through the grind that you talked about, there's some beautiful growth that happens.
oh my God, it's a lot of you have not had the privilege and the experience of meeting Dr. Kempler, one of my mentors. Roger knows him quite well. He had an edge to him that was very difficult. He would confront you in a way that people described his behavior as doing surgery without anesthesia. I mean, but if you were able to move past that and look at what he was saying, it was brilliant. He had the ability to pick up themes and to be able to see someone that was unbelievable, even though sometimes he was off in his ability to be able to deliver it in a way that might be
Yeah.
more available or accessible for a person. But if you did the work, see, this is back to this thing is no one's coming, right? It's also my job, regardless of how you meet me, to separate the wheat from the chaff. What can be nourishing for me here and what do I have to throw away? If it just depends on you doing it the right way, then I'm once again too interdependent. I'm too dependent on you meeting me in the right way for me to grow. And I don't want that. I want to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff so that I can take what nurtures me from a relationship and grow with it and move with it, regardless of the way it's being packaged. I can sort through that.
Yeah.
Now, does that take some maturity? Hell yeah. Does that take a lot of work? Oh yeah. I'm not saying any of that's easy, but it is a possibility. See, that's what we want to emphasize here. It's possible to get to that place if you become more and more differentiated. Now, that's the other thing, Roger, I think that you were bringing up too, because I like a lot of the stuff you were saying, because see, the other thing is the more differentiated I am, the more I can see you, and not just see you as a source of approval or disapproval. And that's Brandon says that so well because self-esteem and differentiation, I think of them synonymously in many ways. The higher your self-esteem, the more differentiated you're going to be. The more differentiated you're going to be, the more self-esteem you're going to have. I mean, they really are hand in hand, right? They're very synonymous in many ways, and both of them, and there's just different ways of talking about this process of our maturation is
Yeah.
going from environmental support, that's an undifferentiated, low self-esteem place. I'm okay if you think I am. That's low self-esteem, right? I'm okay if you think I am. To a place of I'm okay regardless of how you think about me. Less environmental support, more self-support. And that's what self-esteem does. It gives us a chance to support ourselves, and that's what differentiation does.
Yeah, I remember in when we did a couple sessions on differentiation, we talked about how it's not a straight line, right? Or it's not an even, like I might have more differentiation with Roger than with you, or with you on this topic versus you on another topic, right? So being, again, it comes back to awareness, being present, being willing to sift through this experience to find out what I take more personally than others, and to delve a little deeper. In my meditation book group I meet with on Friday mornings. We're doing Don Miguel Ruiz's The Voice of Knowledge, and he does a brief recap on, the four agreements, one of which is don't take things personally. And we were talking about, even if I take things personally, I shouldn't take it personally, right? Like, don't beat myself up if that arises. Take a look at it, right? That's the opportunity.
That's it. That goes with the theme, Tom, of saying this is a developmental issue. So don't sit there and say, look at how messed up I am.
Yeah.
It's just no, look at the development where I'm at in my development, and now I need to take the next step. And it's always about a next step. That's the thing about recovery. We know that we're never done. There's always a next. There's always a next. Nobody finishes this thing.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
Okay, well, shall we? Anybody else? Raj, did you want to add anything else?
Well,
Or?
just a couple. I talked last week about how we move from, taking anything and everything personally. You mentioned getting cut off on the road as a trivial example. To me, that's a big example. If somebody looks at me in a way I don't like, if somebody
You
frowns
looking
at
at me.
me,
You looking at
that
me.
yeah, quit looking at me. But that's all it takes. I mean, I feel that reactivity. So another way that I didn't mention last week, in addition to your emotional sobriety inventory with the 5 columns and so on, as we grow in our self acceptance, we become able to take the behavior of other people less personally. And I mean that in 2 ways. Alan, you mentioned one in the chapter, which is if somebody indicates to me they think I'm stupid, but my self-concept is such that no, I'm a reasonably intelligent person. I don't abandon myself, right? Or subtract myself, as you talk about it now. And I hold on to myself. And so I'm not going to take that defensively.
Yeah.
But even if they point out something to me, like say I put on some weight, well, I've been on this prednisone medication. If somebody were to comment on it, if I have a judgment about that within myself that I have not come to some kind of accommodation to, some kind of peace with, I'm likely to be quite reactive to that. If, on the other hand, even if the thing is true, that's the distinction I'm making, that they're saying to me, but I am in a place of acceptance and comfort about that rather than judgment, I'm much less likely to react personally. So, self acceptance is another very important way as we learn to come to terms with and accept different, you know, parts of ourselves, whether we see them as strengths or we see them as weaknesses, whether we see them as, things that are right with us or things that are wrong with us. As we come into greater and greater acceptance toward those parts of ourselves, our tendency to be reactive about any of those attributes is going to start to drop off dramatically. So that's the other piece I wanted to add, Al.
Well, it reminded me of two other things that I just thought of is that also when we're differentiated, there's a lot more room to discover a creative solution. When you're undifferentiated, all your responses are stereotyped and rigid. You keep doing the same thing because you don't have that flexibility. The more differentiated you are, the more flexible you become in terms of your response ability, the
Right.
ability to respond. The other thing that changes as you become more differentiated is when you hit trouble, instead of it being about blaming, you become curious, right? You start to investigate, you start to reflect, you contemplate rather than project and blame, right? It's a big shift in consciousness that takes place.
And part of the process of that is it's just about what you call the second voice in this chapter, but part of the process is that might begin with a blameful reaction starting in me in terms of the first
Yeah,
emotional reaction I have and body reaction, a
yeah,
stiffening or a tension I have, or if I'm pissed off, my jaw might start to come forward a little bit, my eyes might harden a little bit. But if I can be aware of that and not act on it and step back and go, oh, there's that part of me. Now I'm going to come from a different part of me. I'm going to have a more reflective response, rather than a reaction, as you've talked about it, Al. So it can still start as our old way of reacting, right? But it doesn't have to control us anymore. It doesn't have to take possession of us anymore.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see, that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.